That's right. I don't want to stay very long tonight anyway, given the heat of the room. But I was trying to give some thought as to where to go at the beginning of this course. And given that I can't remember what we treated last week, I'm thinking that maybe what we have to bear in mind is what is it really that makes us to be, you might say, ethical animals. And when you live in a world in which everybody thinks he's got his own ethics, you ask yourself, why should there be claims that there's some kind of an objective set of things that are right and wrong? Everything seems to be today a matter of feeling. I think Obama defined sin as being not being in conformity with your own values. Well, of course, that implies that everybody's got his own values, which means he's a complete relativist. But don't feel too hard on him, because most people tend to be. So the real question is, if you're not a relativist, and of course relativism gives rise to permitting anything, as you well know, if you're not a relativist, how do you establish the claim that there is some absolute, correct, right way of doing things? And of course, we are going to see as we go through this course that you've got an interplay between the notion that there are some things that are absolutely right or wrong on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you've got the problem of what we might call subjective morality, and that is that even if something is right or wrong, when people perform these acts, sometimes they're not responsible for them. And we tell people, well, ultimately you have to follow your own conscience. But if you follow your own conscience, then how can you insist that there's some objective standard? You see, so that there's always this interplay. People are always proclaiming the primacy of conscience, and in the process implying that each person then has his own set of values and his own morality, so you don't have the right to judge anybody else. If you can't judge anybody else, how can you have an objective set of standards? So I think it has to be said at the outset, as I vaguely recall saying in the last class, that there is a framework, there is a context in which ethics arises. And that there's all kinds of ethical systems out there, but the problem with all of them but one is that they are restricted to a certain limited part of reality. For example, for the existentialists, since they don't really have a context of explaining where they come from, they just say, well, here I am, I find myself in the world, and my project is to more or less make myself. So the only thing they're concerned with is what they call authenticity, making sure that the choices we make conform to what we really sincerely want them to be, or what we want ourselves to be. Well, that's well and good, but it's just a little bit and piece of reality that they're grabbing hold of, a very subjective piece of reality. And because it is so subjective, because it's so much a matter of what I make to be my ethical value system, then if I've got mine, but you've got yours, you see. Everybody can have his own. And that flies directly in the face of having any kind of objective, universal moral code. The materialists, of course, relativists, have no basis for an objective moral system. Most people talk about what they feel to be right or wrong. And since feelings change from person to person, obviously, again, everybody's going to wind up with his own system. Or you can even have something as famous as the deontological system of Immanuel Kant, which is based on the idea of setting down a kind of universal maxim that you want everybody to observe. But even that has its limitations, because you're limited by the maxims that you set down. I mean, I might not want anybody else to commit thievery, but somebody else might not care. In other words, you're still dealing with a very limited framework in which to try to generate your ethics. If you're going to get an objective ethical system, you need more than a limited framework. You need a total framework. And that is why, as I think I explained in the previous class, you need to have the philosophical sciences of psychology and metaphysics behind you. You need to understand what the nature of man is. Because how on earth can you figure out what's going to be right or wrong for us if you don't know what we are? And if there's a God, that makes a huge difference too. I would suggest, and I'm going to say it many times, that without God, you don't have any ethics at all. I realize the atheists will jump up and down at you and say, I've got my ethical system. Well, yes, they do, but it's theirs. It's not God's. And if God exists, we better be doing it his way. I know that sounds very imperious, but the problem with the existence of God for the relativist is we don't get to elect God. We find ourselves in a world that we didn't throw ourselves into, like the existentialists almost imply, but we got created. We got put here. And that's why what we call natural law ethics is grounded in a reality framework which is absolutely essential, but it's the only one that makes sense because the other systems don't really have a framework. And the framework which we establish in philosophical psychology and in metaphysics tells us that we aren't making our own being, we're not establishing our own ethics by the choices we make or by our own history, but rather we are given the context of our ethics by the fact that we are creatures of an omnipotent, transcendent, omniscient, infinite, all-powerful, all-good creator. And as such, that immediately stamps our existence with a context that we cannot ignore even if we want to. It also means that our existence is given a structure which the existentialists don't have. Remember, the existentialists talk about God as being like a paper cutter. You don't have any transcendent paper cutter setting down the structure of our being. And that's why we make our own rules for the existentialist. But to make it the other way around, we must realize that we are indeed the product of the intentional creation of an infinite God. Jean-Paul Sartre, when he was 14 years old, decided to become an atheist on the spur of the moment, virtually. And from that point forward, he tried to work out what then is the meaning of the world and of life, given that there's no God.
I know that the framework in which we're working would answer this, but when you're trying to sell us to the larger society, aren't they going to come back at you with if you're bringing in God, then that's subjective, being subjective. If that's the basis for your ethics, and you're saying that your ethics follow an objective law, but you drag God into it.
I'm not suggesting that in the body politic that this is always going to be the best way to proceed. It depends upon the structure of the society in which you find yourself. It doesn't hurt to remind people in the American society that the Declaration of Independence says that we were endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights.
But you made the point, too, last week about not arguing the same-sex marriage debate from sectarian biblical interpretation.
What I was referring to there particularly would be those who argue it from the standpoint of divine revelation from the Bible. You can argue natural law without reference to the Bible or without reference to private revelation or public revelation. But of course, the whole point is if you're going to talk about ethics to people in society, you have to understand it yourself first. And that's what the purpose of a course like this is, to for us to understand the framework out of which we are proceeding. When you're dealing in any kind of a debate format in the public, you have to work with what people accept and what people know. Unfortunately, this means sometimes you're doing it with one hand tied behind your back intellectually. But it doesn't mean you can't do it, because the viewpoint that we are espousing, I would hope, would represent good sense at every level. And therefore, those who have a misguided lack of ethics, if exposed to common sense reality, should find that what they're saying ultimately doesn't work too well. And indeed, we see this in society where you have a breakdown of marriage and the family and the right to life. We see the decadence that results in a social anarchy, virtually, and a welfare state that cannot handle the products of its own misbehavior. So to some extent, is that a pragmatic argument? Yes, it is. There's nothing wrong with a pragmatic argument if you can show somebody that what they're doing will lead them over a cliff. You might be able to back them up enough to get them back up on top of the cliff, and maybe then you can get them to reflect about where the total framework should be. But politics is the art of the possible. Here we're trying to deal with what is the truth. If we don't first grasp truth as fully as possible, it's hard to proceed. And that's why I'm just trying to reflect tonight on why is it that there is such a thing as ethics? Why can we be certain that this structure that we're going to go through is something real, and that it's not just something made up? That it really requires that we determine that there are morally good or morally bad acts. Now, everybody intuitively knows this. Most people intuitively know there are some things that are just horrible that shouldn't be done. But the purpose of studying ethics is to understand why they shouldn't be done, and to be able to give ultimate explanations as to why they shouldn't be done, if we're going to have a true science of ethics. But the science of ethics doesn't exist in a vacuum. And that's why we have to surround it. You've got to put it in a picture where there is that framework of the existence of God and the existence of human nature, if you're going to properly understand it and to understand why it is obligatory to follow ethical norms and not just a matter of somebody's pious belief. But in order to do that, we do have to grant that structure. So tonight I'm going to assume that we do have that structure, because after all, we did just finish the course in philosophical psychology, and most of you attended most of it, I think, and therefore I'm going to presume that background in order to give an answer to the real question of why there's necessity to ethical values. I'm also going to presume that God exists. I gave you a shorthand argument for it in the previous class. Now I'm going to accept not only that God exists, but I'm going to fill in all we know from metaphysics about God and take that to the table and establish why this is the framework which gives rise to the necessity of ethical judgments. Now, some of the material in your notes, I'm going to kind of skip a little bit through it tonight. We'll come back and hit it in greater detail in a subsequent class. Edwin?
But surely there are ethics that can be proven and argued persuasively without necessarily introducing arguments about the existence of God, right?
Well,
just on the basis of
hate to say it,
being a threat to civilization.
But then you're making an assumption that civilization ought not be threatened.
But it's self-destruction.
That's
so,
right.
I mean, you can make the physical argument.
So what's wrong? So what's wrong with self-destruction?
Because it's better to exist than to not exist.
Well, how do we know that? See
Isn't it a self-evident principle?
It may be. I don't want to really argue with you too much against what your proper intelligence is grasping hold of here. But what I'm really trying to get at is that if you ask, why oughtn't I do anything? the best arguments you're going to get fall back on a kind of natural law philosophy that says it's inherent in human nature that we ought to do certain things, and if we don't do them, it is self-destructive. But here's the difficulty. Why shouldn't society destroy itself? Why shouldn't I destroy myself? You say existence is better than non-existence. But if there's nothing above me, I'm not responsible to anybody. And I may find life so nasty and unenjoyable that to me it would be better just to get out of it than to remain in it and suffer the way that I'm presently suffering. So to affirm existence for me is to seek the happiness of avoiding the misery of the life that I'm in. And there's nobody to tell me I shouldn't do it. That is the problem ultimately for the atheist. He can ultimately say, I've got my principles, but they're his principles. There's nobody above him telling him he's got to have these principles. He is responsible to no one. He is literally spondeo, to answer. He answers back to no one. He's got nobody to answer to. There's nobody above him, and if he wants to espouse some other principle or some other value, there's nothing to gainsay it. Because he is setting his own rules, ultimately. He becomes his own creator. And when you are the creator, you set up your own commandments, ultimately. And that's why I would say, in the last analysis, if you're an atheist, I would worry about having you as my babysitter. Because I can't ultimately be sure what you're operating on, or why you might not decide to do something very differently than you've been doing up to this point. You can assure me with your subjective psychology, this is what I stand for and I'm not going to change, but how do I know? You're making up your own rules. So it does make a difference. I'm not saying I wouldn't argue as you suggest. I mean, we surely should in the public arena. We should tell people, you follow certain courses of action, you're going to destroy the society. And indeed, 99% of the people in their right mind will say, let's not destroy society. But we are trying to find what is the ultimate foundation for the necessity of ethical obligation. And in order to do that, you ultimately do need to have the existence of God as the guarantor, the one who insists that we reach certain ethical achievements. But let's back that up a wee bit. We're going to talk a little bit about finality. If you look down at the bottom of the page, I think the next thing we were going to do is talk about the end. The end is a principle of order, and a measure of good and bad enacts order to it. Well, and it says ethics cannot exist without men having a provable last end as a measure. In very simple terms, what this comes down to is if we are going to live our lives, if we're going to try to figure out what we should do or what we shouldn't do, and of course even the question of is there a should or is there a shouldn't, many people would argue that one. But if we're going to determine what we ought to do, we have to ask ourselves, where are we going? If we don't know where we're going, you ever ask somebody, what are you doing? They say nothing. It's like the teenager bolting out the door, and mother asked him, Johnny, where are you going? Nowhere. Well, what are you going to do? Nothing. Well, assuredly, his mother knows that the answer to both those questions is not the truth, because he sure as heck is going somewhere with great alacrity, and he sure is about to do something, and you hope it isn't the worst. So if you're going to intelligibly and intelligently ask what it means to live, and living means doing certain things, we have to have some notion of where we're going. And to know where we're going, we've got to know if there's such a thing as an end. And of course, we've dealt before with the Darwinian naturalists who would claim there aren't any ends. There aren't any ends to anything. So if you have a complete lack of teleology, you're going to also have a lack of morality. There's no reason why any ecosystem should be promoted rather than any other, ultimately. Where you're getting the values that tell you that has to be done. I mean, why shouldn't we eat everything around? And of course, the argument is, well, if you eat everything around, then you're going to destroy yourselves. But we've already been over that one. So why shouldn't we destroy ourselves? Where are you going to get a hold of something that's tangible, that you can't let go, that insists that there are norms of morality, and you can't just make them up or throw them away as you choose? Since God does exist, let's put the framework on here. Since God does exist and does create us, and does create all natural entities, he establishes for them what they are and what they are about and what they are to do. God, of course, is intelligent. Has to be, because among the things he's created is us, who are, we hope, intelligent beings. Not always the case, but we hope. And if we are intelligent beings, or even some of us, God must be intelligent to make us. So God is an intelligent being when he creates the world, and that means, like any other intelligent being, he does so with purpose. Because an intelligent being acts with intentionality, acts towards producing a particular work with a particular result. And if we look at the world around us, I realize, to the Darwinian naturalist, every species running around is a product of blind chance. No purpose, nothing at all. But you see, the other way of looking at it is that everything that's running around is the product of divine providence. See, these are two completely different ways of looking at the world. You can't just interchange one for the other, or borrow part from this and part from that. If God exists, if he is omniscient, if he is all-powerful, if he is the creator of all things, everything that's here is here because of the way that he wills it to be. When he creates natures, they are to be as he makes them. And that is why we find in creatures what we call intrinsic finality and extrinsic finality. Intrinsic finality means that they're operating according to their nature to maintain their own existence and to maintain the existence of their species. And that's true from the lowest microbe on up. Carrots and radishes and rabbits and rhinoceroses, all of them operate to maintain their own existence, to defend themselves, and to propagate their species, to keep life going of their own type, either by asexual or bisexual reproduction. That's their intrinsic finality. Now, from a theistic standpoint, God, making the universe and putting intelligent beings in it, must be subordinating all these other things that he has made to their last end, because they have a spiritual destiny which proceeds beyond that of this world. So we have, with lower creatures, you have an intrinsic finality, but you also have an extrinsic finality. For example, the plankton live and reproduce, but you know what their extrinsic finality is? They're food for the whales. In fact, the whole food chain is an example of extrinsic finality. Everybody who's lower on the chain has an extrinsic finality of being the food for the next one up. And ultimately, we have a world which is designed for man. Obviously, the atheistic, naturalistic philosophers aren't going to accept any of this. So it makes a huge difference if you view the world as something that has been created by God. And if you view man as not just being another species among all of the species, but as being literally at the top. And you know that's a big fight going on today. There are a lot of people out there trying to say we're just one more species. And they accuse us of speciesism if we discriminate against lower species by doing things like having them as hamburgers. We have no right to do that. We're violating their rights. Wherever they got those rights from, I know not. But you see, if we are essentially superior to other animals, then you look at this from God's standpoint, we are his crowning creation. And in fact, if we have spiritual and immortal souls, which we know from Phil Psych we do, Our purpose, our goal, our finality transcends this world. We are in a unique position. The world is intelligible in terms of our presence. And this is why those who said, well, you know, with the Copernican revolution, we suddenly discovered that man wasn't the center of the universe because his planet wasn't at the very center of the cosmos. Well, of course, they missed the whole point. Man is still at the center of the universe because he is essentially superior to every other creature in the entire universe. If you have a galaxy out there with 10 billion stars and there are no intelligent beings in it, we still are the center of the universe relative to it. And if there are intelligent beings, that doesn't take away the fact that all these lesser things, the inanimate, the animate, the sentient, are still subordinated to intelligent beings. Because anytime you have intelligent beings, you have a spiritual and immortal soul which has an eternal destiny. So the very cosmos remains subordinated to the kinds of being which we are, and in the entire universe, the only place we know there are such beings is right here on planet Earth. It's the only place we're sure of. I wrote an article that deals with this, but can't go into that tonight. But that being the case, you see, all other creatures have an intrinsic finality, which makes them operate and reproduce, but they have an extrinsic finality which subordinates them to a hierarchy of values within the universe, the topmost of which is man. So it's okay to have a hamburger. It's okay to swat that nasty mosquito. You may do it with a twinge of regret, knowing that it has a modicum of existence and perfection and goodness, that you really shouldn't, you know, you should be a little sorry it's gone. I gave this lecture once to a class, I remember, telling them about the beauty and the importance of every living creature that God has created, the goodness that is found in the least of creatures, and how we ought to respect them all. And towards the end of the class, a big hornet came flying in and landed right in the aisle, right in front of me. And I could see all the students looking at it and wondering, what do we do after he's telling us this wonderful creature? We should respect the being and dignity of everything. So I waited till the class was over. And I promptly just walked forward and stamped on it, killed it, much to their utter horror. But of course, one has to remember that it is subordinate to our interest, and that it is better that we not be stung by it. The only thing I admonish them is that when you do this, do it with a twinge of regret. A little tiny feeling of sorrow. You can be ebullient about the fact you got rid of the beast, but you should realize that you did diminish the being and goodness of the world in the slightest measure by having removed it from existence. So, here we are, asking ourselves, what is the intrinsic finality of man? Because we, unlike any other creature in the cosmos, we are not subordinated to others. Man is, in a sense, an end in himself, not to be used as a means. Even Kant recognized that. Not to be used as a means to something else. Our last end, our finality, transcends this world because we have a spiritual and immortal soul. And we have to ask, what is our end? All the creatures, as St. Thomas points out, lower creatures achieve their end, in a sense, by reaching God because they imitate God in reflecting a bit of the goodness of God. Because you see, when you talk about things acting towards an end, God, in creating everything, creates everything ultimately for a purpose. Now, is that purpose outside of him? It can't be. If it were, he'd have need of something he doesn't have. So the last end, I remember one friend of mine coming home from class and telling me that he just taught utter heresy in his class because they were asking, why did God make us? Why did God make the world? And he said, well, it's because he loved us. And then he came home and thought about it and realized you can't say that. I'm not saying God doesn't love us. Of course God loves us. But if he loved us, we would be if that was his ultimate reason, we'd be the end of his action. The only fitting end of God's action is himself. There is no lesser end which can be appropriate to the divine act. It has to, remember, he's subsistent existence, perfect simplicity. He is his own act. And his own act is an eternal and infinite love of himself. It's okay to love yourself like that if you're God. Problem with loving ourselves like we were God is that we're not God. And it's an inappropriate love for us. We call it pride. So God, in creating all things, orders them ultimately to himself. And that means even the least of creatures move towards God as their last end, but they do it in the only way they can, and that is by perfecting themselves as the individual within the species that they are. So, if you're going to be a cactus, your imitation of God consists in being the most perfect cactus you can be. Now, I realize that isn't very much, but that, of course, is the whole point of the hierarchy of being. Lower beings don't have that much of being and goodness to express, but they express it fully by actualizing their own nature. As you move up the chain of being, greater perfection is found, and therefore a greater imitation of God is expressed. The goodness of God is expressed in each creature in a more perfect way, and therefore those things attain their end of imitating God, which is the only way in which they can have God as their end. But when it comes to man, when it comes to you and me, it's a different picture. For one thing, lower creatures don't have a choice. They have to act according to their nature. If you're a cactus, what do you do except sit there and cact? It's all you can do. It's all you can be. If you're an animal, yes, you have sensory powers that enable you to infinitely variegate your response to the stimuli of your experience so that you perfect yourself in different ways that are almost unpredictable to us. But in the last analysis, you don't have free will, and you are therefore following the dictates of your sensory, passionate nature. But when it comes to man, we too have passions, but we have this wonderful, sometimes accursed property called free will, by which we can either perfect or degrade our being. And that's why, unlike any other creature, we have what we call ethics. We have the ability to perform acts that are consonant with our nature and therefore self-perfective. But we also have the ability to perform acts that are not consonant with our nature and are therefore self-destructive. We are able to perform acts that lead us towards our last end and those that lead us away from our last end. Our last end is also God. The subjective last end that we all know is that we all want to be happy. As I asked you before, put up your hands if you don't want to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. The question is, how should you be happy? Well, if you notice in all those lower creatures, the vegetative, the animal, they are most perfect when their natures are most perfectly fulfilled. If you're a horse, it's really great to have 4 legs. Not so wonderful to have 3. That's a physical evil. It's a defect in the nature of a horse to have only 3 legs. To have disease is a lack of ease. It's a lack of the perfection of health, which is appropriate to every organism. So, but they don't have a choice about it, you see. Their nature dictates, to the extent that it can, that they fulfill that nature as best they can, and in so doing they achieve their perfection and goodness in themselves and in God's sight. But we, you see, we have a nature too. God does create us. And as Jean-Paul Sartre properly notes, If God exists, then when he creates us, he stamps in us a template. He stamps in us a nature, a project to be fulfilled. That's what Sartre is denying. He's saying there is no God, so there is no nature, except the free choice to make your own nature. That, again, is why it makes a difference, whether you're an atheist or not. But God does exist. And because God does exist and can be proven to exist in metaphysics, God, therefore, does establish in creating us a fixed nature, which we all share. We call it human nature, that of being a rational animal, that in addition to possessing the vegetative powers of nutrition, growth, and reproduction, and the sentient powers of sensation and locomotion, we also possess intellect and will, and free will. And that means that in pursuing our activities, there are two things you got to keep an eye on. One, we have a free will, so it's up to us what we do. No guarantee that we're going to do it right. And two, we do still have a nature, just like everything else. And if nature, being fulfilled, dictates the perfection of our being, then the will needs to conform to our nature in order for us to be perfect, in order for us to be good, to be worthwhile as a human being. A horse that's got a sway back and only 2 legs is a pretty bad horse. And a human being who fails freely to perfect his own nature is a bad human being. That's where we get the notion of what is a good or bad man. A man isn't bad because he's got 1 leg. He's bad because he's a car thief. That's the difference. He has a physical imperfection if he has just 1 leg. That's true. He's got a bad leg, or no leg at all. He's a bad walker, but he's not a bad man, not a bad human being. To be a good or a bad human being is measured by whether you choose those acts that are perfective of your nature or contrary to your nature. And to measure that, we have to remember that our last end is God, just as every creature's last end is God. The difference between us and those other creatures is that our last end is not in this life. It can't be, because we are built right into us is a desire, that you've all got it, for happiness. You can't help wanting to be happy. What's going to make you happy? St. Thomas goes through a whole bunch of things in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, chapters 1 through 63, where he explores all the things that could possibly make us happy. And you've heard them all before. You know, some people want to have...
Happy meal at McDonald's.
The what?
Happy meal at McDonald's.
That's right. I want a Happy Meal at McDonald's. And you know, the problem is that, you know, little kids do want that. But you know the problem, once you get it, okay, now I got a tummy ache. So, when you're a little kid, you want all kinds of things. You know, I wanted a train. That was back when they made trains. And, you know, it's a wonderful thing, and then you get it, and you find there's only so much track. And you find the spring breaks, or the electricity breaks down. It doesn't last. Some people seek material goods, but you know, if you live long enough, they don't give you back what you think they're going to. The mistake you make is you put more into them than they can give you back. You treat them like they're God, and they're not God, and they leave you short. Some people think that they, you know, just give me all the pleasures my body can experience. Well, the problem with that is our bodies, even if you got everything you wanted, your bodies eventually wear out. They don't experience so well anymore. Why do you think the 80-year-old is emptying the pepper shaker on his hamburger so he can still taste it? I'm sorry, Joe. That's all right, I'm not that far behind you. The problem is that our senses reach their peak when we're very young. That's, of course, why the very young do all the reproducing, or most of it. But the senses wear out. They cease to give us what we hope they will give us. So even if you get everything you want, it eventually doesn't work anymore. If you get every material possession you can have, you always want more because you're never satisfied. You're dealing with finite goods. And the problem is we have an intellect, and the intellect can conceive always of something better because we know the good as such. We got the concept of the good. And we know that whatever you've got that's good, it could be better. We're always trying to make progress. We're always trying to improve. We're always trying to get a little bit more and more and more. And you know the end of the story. There is no more, ultimately. And beyond all other things, unfortunately, I always used to, again, ask my students, what are you doing in life? Well, why are you here at college? Well, so I can get a job. Okay, so you're going to get a job, and what are you going to do after you get the job? Well, I hope to get promoted. Okay, that's good, so you got promoted. And what are you going to do with that? Well, I've got a career. I'm going to work my way to the top. Okay, you work your way to the top. Now what are you going to do? Well, I guess I'll retire and enjoy myself. Okay, now what are you going to do? You've retired and enjoy yourself. What are you looking forward to next? Slowly you begin to get it through their head that, that this is a short-term enjoyment project. We're not going to live forever. We're going to give it up, and that's the problem. Man has an unlimited desire for life and an unlimited desire for the experience of the good, but we are trapped in a world and in a life of radical contingency, dealing with finite goods that are going to wear out and break down, including our own bodies, with a guarantee of truth. That's one thing some of the existentialists got right. They define man as a sein zum Tod, being towards death. We are living in the face of the fact that we're going to die, and the existentialists pull their hair out because they're trying to make some meaning out of what is essentially a meaningless life, knowing that no matter what you do in 100 years, it's all over and gone. That's why they come up with these philosophies that are so unsatisfactory, ultimately. But from the standpoint of a theistic, created perception, our life has a meaning because we are endowed by God with a spiritual soul that has an end which transcends this life. But how do we get to that end? And what is that end ultimately? Ultimately, it is God, and we can see this because no limited good satisfies us. We've been built with an intellect that can always conceive of something better. And something better than that, something better than that. No finite good could ever satisfy us because we always could want more, which means we're built to seek God himself, the infinite good, the only perfect, ultimate good. And how can we get to God? Certainly not in this life. Not in this life. It must be then that, and remember, God created us. He has intentions in making us as he does. This life, logically, not religiously, logically must be a test to determine how we will use our free will either to perfect or degrade our nature, because by free choices, we can either live in accord with our nature and perfect it, or we can live against it and destroy it. And it isn't the destruction of death, because that's inevitable, which we need fear by our misdeeds, but it is the fact that we will not have lived as God intended us to live. And failing to live as God intends us to live is the definition of being a bad human being, not worthy of attaining the end for which we are created. So the logic of ethics is that we are in a unique position in which by free will we cannot help it, we will determine the outcome of our life. We will determine where we are headed. And the measurement of how we're supposed to live is, as Dr. Waters has many times said, human nature adequately considered. Human nature adequately understood. Ethics seeks to understand human nature, to understand what things are consonant with our nature and what things are violative of our nature. That's what we do in ethics. And therefore, ethics is the science that tells us what kinds of things we need to do in order to achieve happiness, or what kind of things to do to miss happiness. It's our choice. It's our choice. But that's why it's wrapped up in the notion of end, and it's why you can't just have any old ethics you want. It isn't a free choice to pick whichever ethics you want, because we do live in a universe in which we are in a framework in which we have a fixed nature determined by an infinite creator to whom we are responsible. The reason I have no right to destroy my own life through suicide, and society has no right of self-extinction, is because we are responsible. We are answerable to our Creator, not to ourselves. I can't just make up any rule or law that I want to make up. I have to obey the law that has been given to me by my Creator, which law is written in my very being. It's not something written down on paper. It is the very structure of my existence. It's the order of my existence to that alone which will give it happiness, and I am made by my Creator to seek that happiness. What I throw away when I misuse my free will and my nature is my attainment of happiness. And no one would, in his right mind, choose to do that, but clearly people do choose to do that, don't they? That's the whole unsatisfactory aspect of freedom. A misconceived notion of love in which they love themselves first. You know, we're born into this world utterly selfish beings. That's what a little baby is. Everything is me, me, me. I don't even know you. I don't know anything. I start out, maybe I know my mother, and then I know my father, and then I begin to know other people. And the whole work of life is to unfold from that narcissistic self-absorption and open up to the other, which is other people, the good of other people, ultimately to the recognition that there's a transcendent other to whom I am called, and to realize that ultimately to love that ultimate other is the call of my nature. And as one of the saints points out to us, the ultimate act of love is that we love God above all things, including ourselves, so that we love even ourselves for the sake of God. It's a complete other pole. You now try to talk about that to the public press. Nobody's going to know what you're talking about. You can cut off little pieces and talk about it in the snippets of our own limited societal context. But the ultimate answer, the ultimate truth we have to realize is that everything is ultimately going to be centered and absorbed and perfected in the attainment of God Himself. And that we will not even love ourselves perfectly unless we love ourselves for the sake of God. Because our own nature is ultimately that ordered to God. But this is why ethics is not purely arbitrary. It's why we can't just make up an ethical system that sounds good and we say, well, I'm following this principle, or, pragmatism or utilitarianism or something like that, because those principles are just little snippets of reality, and usually they're perverted snippets. They misunderstand the total picture. What we are talking about, what we'll be exploring, is natural law ethics. And natural law ethics is simply a recognition that God has given us a nature. It is the eternal law from the standpoint of God looking at us, but it's the natural law from the standpoint of us receiving this nature from God. And we can't make it up. We can't invent reality. A lot of people want to invent reality. They're going to make up what their ethics will be, because it's their ethics. They'll say, it's my ethics. I'm going to determine what's right or wrong for me. And of course, this is an ultimate perversion of what it means to be a human being. They're not really loving themselves properly, because to love yourself, remember, the object of love is being, and being is truth. If you love yourself in truth, you got to see the truth that we are a creature of God. And therefore, the polarity of everything that we do has to be ordered to God as our last end, or we miss out on what it is to be fully a human being. And that is self-destructive. Okay, any questions?
I just want to clarify so I understand. Ethics, of course, is not moral theology.
No.
No, it's different. But at the same time, moral theology ultimately coming from divine revelation. But at the same time, ethics is, we still have God as giving us the structure.
It's going to be completely consistent with moral theology.
It will be consistent.
Moral theology can go beyond it.
Right.
But
But I'm
it-
saying, but if I can speak this way, the God that we're talking about in ethics is the God that we've reasoned to, rather than the God that has told us things about himself.
But it's the same being.
I know it's the same
Yeah.
being, but the structure that we're dealing with, the way we're dealing with it, I mean, you're not going to, when we talk about that it's wrong to kill people,
Yeah.
you might mention that, the fifth commandment at the end,
Yeah.
but the God that we're dealing with in ethics is the one that we've reasoned to through
That's
the proof from motion
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Then, and then the attributes that flow from that.
It's sort of like the difference between the Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles. If you look at the structure of the Summa Theologiae, because it's a work of theology, St. Thomas always says, on the contrary, and then he cites some saint or some teaching of revelation, and then he supports it with reason. But in the Contra Gentiles, he does the opposite. He reasons to the truth of what he's arguing about, and then he says, and this, of course, is what conforms to what some saint or the scripture has said.
Right.
So
Okay.
what we're doing is following pretty much more the method of the Summa Contra Gentiles, that this is reasoning which will lead to conclusions properly done that will not conflict
Right.
with divine revelation properly understood.
Mhm.
There can be no conflict between divine revelation correctly understood and reason about reality correctly understood. But there can be a lot of conflicts where people don't understand things, of course. Anybody else? Helen?
Yes, something that you had said last week made me think of the Lord of the Flies. When a child is born, he's not given, he's given a soul, but he's not given ethics. That's something he has to be passed on.
He gets the soul at conception, of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said when he's born.
Sorry about that. So it's a social order, it's culture.
Well, clearly,
That
yeah.
determines the ethic that you're gonna have. And then I thought something about, and I'm gonna bring the Bible in now, because we're over. The Bible says that, the law that is written on men's hearts.
Yeah, but, well, you said that it's what society teaches you. You may have been raised by a bunch of cannibals,
Right.
but at some point in time, you ought to, on your own, begin to realize it really is not that you're supposed to eat your neighbor.
Right, so is that an intrinsic human operation?
Yes, we do.
Right
We
now?
do have, just as we have this natural metaphysics of human intelligence that leads us to understand being as being, so too we do have a natural disposition towards the good. It can be badly perverted, though, by miseducation and de-education. So that is a real problem. That's why parents have a tremendous obligation to raise their children properly.
So this is a deformation of human nature.
If they're taught wrong,
If they're
yeah,
taught wrong.
absolutely.
Yeah. So they're not only, doing wrong, they're losing their nature. They're deforming their.
Well, you can't deform your nature, but what you can do is acquire habits in conflict with your nature. intellectual and moral habits. And that, of course, is the reason why, for a human being to be properly born and raised in this world and directed at every level, the proper ethical formation should be supported and reinforced. And that is the tragedy of our times, that we live in a secular society that does all in its power to deform and de-educate children and take them even away from the proper authority of their parents to protect and raise them correctly. And then, of course, we have many parents who aren't raising them correctly anyway. But again, our purpose here is to understand, hopefully to understand, what ought to be. And much of what I've been talking about tonight is to explain the force behind that ought. That sometimes they talk about the is-ought dilemma. Just because something is a certain way, why ought it be that way? Well, the ought arises because we are creatures of God and responsible to God. Therefore, the measure of our goodness or evil depends upon whether we respond to that which God has created and ordered in our nature. And that's the sense of the meaning of ought. It isn't purely up to me to decide what ought to be. It comes from the very structure of the created world, coming from an all-good God. Okay, thank you.